Hi, in this video we are going to discuss the other departmental expenses other than the labor cost and F&B cost which we discussed in previous videos. So the other cost you can easily divide. So in this video we are going to discuss the nature and the expense control, how we control the expenses. So the variable, the first type, what we need to understand is the expenses are two types: variable and fixed expenses. So what is a variable expense? The variable expenses are those expenses which increase or decrease in relation with the revenue or occupancy or cover changes. So if the revenue increase by 10%, the variable expenses will also increase by 10%. If the occupied room nights increase by 5%, then the expenses are also likely to be increased by either 5% or maybe 4% or 5.5%. But they increase in relation with the increase in the business. So if the business is increasing by 10% and expenses increase by only 1%, then they are not variable expenses. They are called mostly semi-variable or fixed expense. So variable expenses are analyzed in relationship with the revenue or the quantity as a percentage to revenue, or either per occupied room cost or per cover cost. So when we are reviewing the P&L, so we identify the variable expenses first, then we calculate the percentage or to their revenue or to the occupied rooms or the cover served. Then we are in the best position to explain the reasons of increase or decrease in the expenses. Then fixed expenses are they doesn't change that much, they just change very slightly, because when the volume increased very significantly, the expenses, even the fixed expenses, can change, but the percentage of change will not be same as the variable expense. There are no expenses which are completely fixed except the rental or the fixed contract periods. The other expenses are particularly it depends on the happening. There are a lot of expenses which may not happen even despite the increase in revenue. Let's say, for example, you are buying kettles in the guest room, the hot water kettles. So if the kettles are damaged, even though there may not be any change in the occupancy, it may not increase. However, the expenses will increase. So those items are different from either variable, or they doesn't fall in variable, they doesn't fall in fixed, they fall in as and when they are required. So it's important to understand those kind of expenses. So they are analyzed only in absolute terms, and the increase or decrease is particularly highlighted by any unusual expense that might have incurred during that period of reporting compared to the previous reporting period. So these are some examples of the variable expenses and fixed expenses. So variable expenses mostly consist of food and beverage costs, guest supplies, complimentary gifts, operating supplies, cost of sales, commission, reservation costs, which change as the revenue change, as the business level change. So if there are so many covers, then the food and beverage cost will increase in align with the revenue. It may not be exactly the same percentage, how that is part of analysis why the cost not increasing or decreasing in the same proportion as the revenue. So there may be wastages, there may be some fixed part of fixed element in the cost which you must identify. For example, in food and beverage cost, the breakfast setup, buffet setup cost, they have both components largely which is fixed, because the buffet is set up in the initially, which is a fixed cost. You may have 10 covers, you may have 15 covers. Normally buffet is set up for like 30 people. So if you have less than 30 covers, then the cost remains the fixed. So then these are called step fixed costs, which are fixed at a certain level, and then after that they increase only in relation with the increase in the revenue, uh, or they may increase suddenly after a certain level when you are reaching a certain level of the operations. So the individual hotels operations, they may have different set of variable and fixed expenses depending on their operation setup and how they operate. So the operation managers must be able to understand which expenses of your department are fixed, which expenses are variable, and which expenses are step fixed, or which will trigger only after a certain level of occupancy. So the fixed expenses includes labor cost, maintenance, entertainment, marketing expenses, and administrative expenses, which are mostly fixed. They may be some variable component, but that is not a lot. So what are the other examples? So we may discuss that in the comment box, or you can discuss in person now, so that we can understand. Now the next thing we want to understand is the expense control reports. How do we control? So there are first a few things like inventory management reports. So the inventory management report can control linens, operating supplies, your amenities. So those ones are the items where we can use them, uh, how they are used in the operations, how much they were used in the previous period, is it the price has changed, and then we can compare them with the ratio of the occupied room nights or the cover served. Then the other things are the food cost reports, which are the for to control the variable cost. So we analyze the food cost for each outlet, we check for breakages, we check for wastages, we check for damage, spoilage. Then we see how many of them are imported items, and then we see the potential food cost report. The potential food cost report is the ideal cost that you should have incurred while selling the menu, but the actual cost may be different because of the breakages, because of the spoilages, because of the theft, because of the portion controls, and then reusability of certain items. So these are the food cost report. Then you have equipment, operating equipment reports, which are mostly the amenity supplies and detail of expenses. And then you can compare the control the linens from the and the other operating equipment. And then the operating department should be timely replacing the damaged items so that it doesn't hit 1 month's P&L to change the items. So these are all the expense control reports. If you have any suggestions,